Nolan Wells' autopsy is complete. His toxicology report is finished. Both are locked in a file right now, and you're going to see exactly what's inside them soon. But here's the thing, there's a twist in how that evidence actually gets revealed to the public, and it's going to matter. First, something else is unfolding simultaneously that's equally significant. A forensic team is actively extracting deleted data from Nolan's phone. Every message, every photo, every location ping that was erased. They're racing to reconstruct his final hours minute by minute before the digital evidence degrades or gets accessed again. And while that recovery is happening, the audio specialist who examined the Sato distress call just released her complete methodology and findings. What she found contradicts what the official narrative has been claiming. And then there's this independent forensic pathologist, no connection to the family, no connection to investigators, no stake in the outcome either way, who reviewed the exact same autopsy evidence and discovered one critical detail that fundamentally changes how you should interpret this entire case. One detail buried in the medical findings that raises questions nobody's asked yet. We're walking through all of it: the recovered data, the audio analysis, the sealed autopsy, the evidence the system is trying to protect, piece by piece. We're doing this the way a real investigation works, not the way social media thinks it works. Subscribe right now because you need to see where this leads.
What happened to Nolan Wells? It's a mystery people across the nation are still trying to solve weeks after his body was found. As his parents try to seek out the truth, they requested a second autopsy. Tonight, we're breaking down the preliminary findings of that second autopsy. I spoke with Dr. Judy Melanik, a board-certified pathologist who is not affiliated with this case, about the report. So in cases where a body is found in or around water, what do forensic pathologists tend to look out for when conducting an autopsy?
When a body's in water, it's not always clear whether they died as a result of being in the water, meaning that they drowned, or they died of something else and they were just disposed of in the water. So if there is traumatic injury to the body, like a stab wound or a gunshot wound or strangulation that would kill the person, generally we will defer to that as the cause of death. We will say the cause of death is the trauma and being in the water is irrelevant. Versus if we find, for example, a natural disease process like a heart attack, then if a person had a heart attack while they were swimming, we would still call that a drowning, but we would acknowledge the heart disease as a significant contributing condition. And the same thing would apply for something like drugs or alcohol that incapacitate you and cause you to drown. The cause of death would be drowning, but we would put the drugs or the alcohol as a significant contributing condition.
In the preliminary discussion of the report, the forensic pathologist mentioned several limitations he encountered, one being the absence of several neck structures. For most people, that kind of sounds odd that the body was sent without those parts, but as the report states, that's actually a common forensic pathology practice. Can you explain why those structures might have been kept during the initial autopsy?
So the neck structures would be where you would see any evidence of injury to the neck or potentially strangulation injury. Retaining those structures does not necessarily mean that they have trauma there. They may have been retained out of an abundance of caution, but they may have also shown some sort of injury or disease process like obstruction that necessitated their being kept by the medical examiner because it's evidence. So retaining tissue or organs in a high profile or suspicious case is common practice for a medical examiner and is not sign of any kind of conspiracy or cover-up. That is exactly what the medical examiner is supposed to do when they have a case where they either find trauma or they don't find trauma, but they want to keep it because of the circumstances and the suspicions that have been raised.
The thing about the second autopsy that really stood out to me was that 12 by 8 inch focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissues on the back of his head. And there were no lacerations of the overlying skin or fractures on the skull, according to the report. But can you discuss what could have caused that discoloration?
The second Postmortem exam was done on a body that had been several days from being found. So we're dealing with, I believe, 2 days between when Nolan Wells was first missing and when his body was found and then autopsied, and another 4 days that have passed until the second postmortem exam. So the body is decomposed, it falls apart after death, and discoloration could be a sign of injury, like bleeding, or it could also be a sign of some sort of pressure being applied, potentially during the first autopsy itself. So this particular location on the back of the head is a common area where we place a block during the first autopsy, and that may have been the source of the discoloration, and it may have absolutely nothing to do with trauma. The only way to know is to get pieces of tissue under the microscope, and that is something that Dr. Mitchell, the pathologist who did the second autopsy, is going to be doing, to look to see if that discoloration is bleeding or hemorrhage.
Why might the initial autopsy not have included a dissection of the back of the head where that discoloration was found, like the second autopsy did?
In part, a first autopsy pathologist might not autopsy that area or dissect that area because they don't see anything on the surface of the skin when the body is fresher, so they don't suspect that there's any trauma there. And they may have other parts of the body that have significant findings that they're focusing their attention on. So it's not unusual for a second autopsy pathologist who's given a body that is starting to decompose to work harder to look at areas that the first pathologist may not have looked at because they hadn't suspected injury there, since when the body was fresh, they didn't see any external signs of injury.
And we're all, of course, still waiting on that toxicology report from the initial autopsy. Now, based on these preliminary findings that were laid out in this report and the questions that, still remain about the circumstances surrounding Wells's death, could this case really come down to that toxicology report?
I doubt it. It's not a single report that answers any question. It gives you a piece of the puzzle, but you really need the scene and the circumstances. What is going to make or break this case is going to be the police investigation, finding out exactly how he got into the water, whether he was alone or whether there were other people with him at the time. That's going to make the difference in terms of determining whether it was an accident, as in an accidental drowning, or potentially a homicide.
Here's the detail that changes everything. When Nolan Wells' second autopsy happened, when Dr. Roger Mitchell got the body 4 days after it was pulled from the water, there was a piece missing. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Actually missing, the anterior neck structures. Clinically, it's called the neck block. This is what the forensic pathologist found, and here's why it matters. If someone is manually strangled, if someone has their hands around your throat and they squeeze, the evidence lives in exactly one place. The front of your neck. That's where the airway is. That's where the major blood vessels run. That's where you look for a broken hyoid bone, a small fragile bone in the throat that fractures under pressure. That's where you look for internal bleeding in the strap muscles running down the front of the neck. That's where you look for petechiae, those tiny burst blood vessels that show up in the eyes or face after sustained pressure. All three markers of strangulation. All three located in anatomy that simply wasn't there for Dr. Mitchell to examine. Think about what that actually means. If Nolan was strangled, the evidence wouldn't be obvious. It wouldn't show as cuts or bruises on the surface. A skilled strangler leaves almost nothing visible. The damage is internal, deep, in the exact structures that went missing, and now they're gone, locked away, unavailable, inaccessible to independent review. Now, before you jump to conclusions, understand this. The independent forensic pathologist, Dr. Judy Melinek, board certified, no connection to this case, no agenda whatsoever, looked at exactly the same evidence and said the same thing. Retaining tissue from the first autopsy is normal practice. Sometimes it's kept because something was found and they need to preserve it for evidence. Sometimes it's kept because nothing was found and they're being cautious with important specimens. Both are equally possible right now. But here's what is absolutely certain. Without that anatomy, Dr. Mitchell cannot rule strangulation in. And he cannot rule it out. Not evidence of foul play. A documented gap in what this specific exam could actually determine. Full stop. And that gap exists because the first autopsy report, the one that would explain why that tissue was retained, has never been released to the public. It's sealed. Just like the toxicology report is sealed, just like everything about this case is sealed. And while the medical evidence sits sealed, here's what's actually happening right now. A team is actively reconstructing Nolan's last day, minute by minute, message by message, location by location. His mother subpoenaed Meta, Snapchat, TikTok, Life 360. She demanded his deleted messages, his photos, his GPS data, everything that was ever erased from his phone. Everything. And here's the critical part that most people don't understand about digital evidence. With professional forensic extraction tools, the kind firms like Cellebrite use, data that was deleted isn't actually gone. It's not erased at the data level. It's hidden. The file pointer is removed. The user can't see it, but the raw data is still sitting there on the phone's storage. And with the right equipment and the right expertise, it can be recovered. Not just what was there, but when it was deleted. Who accessed the phone? What account was used? What IP address was involved? What timestamp the deletion happened at? That's not speculation. That's not theory. That's how digital forensics actually works. That's how you rebuild a timeline that can't be disputed. And here's what that timeline will show. When Nolan left his last Snapchat message, whether he was tagging his location from the boat or from the island, whether his TikTok activity stopped at a moment consistent with the distress call or hours later, whether his Life 360 app shows him in one place while his friends' phones show him in another, when his phone went dark, whether it was powered down intentionally or ran out of battery, whether his accounts were accessed after he disappeared, whether messages were sent or deleted from his phone after July 4th. That's what the recovered data will prove. That's what the timeline will show. And that's what Christine Wells is fighting to get. Legal subpoena by legal subpoena, company by company, server by server. But first, let's talk about what the sheriff said, and why it matters so much more than people realize. Days after Nolan disappeared, before any autopsy, before any pathologist had seen the body, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter said publicly there was no foul play. No foul play. Think about that timeline. A kid is missing. His body hasn't been recovered. No medical examination has happened. No evidence has been reviewed. No investigation has even really started. And a law enforcement official is already stating with certainty that foul play isn't involved. That's a documented fact. That's not spin. That's not interpretation. That's what he said. And the question becomes, what did he actually see at that scene that allowed him to make that call so quickly? What specific evidence did he observe that ruled out foul play before the actual process even started? We talked to Morgan Wright, a digital forensics analyst and former detective. And here's what he says happens when those subpoenaed records come back from the tech companies. First thing you do is take all of that information. You map it against the GPS data from the boat. When it left. When it slowed down. When it suddenly accelerated to 35 knots. You map that against the distress call timeline, the exact minute the call was made, the minute help arrived, the minute the boat docked. Then you map all the digital media and the timestamps and locations to that same timeline. You create a complete kaleidoscope of everything that actually happened. When were pictures taken? What time? From what location? Was Nolan on the island at a specific minute or already on the boat? Was he visible in his friends' photos or completely absent? Was he sending messages or silent? Does anything in that data contradict what's already been said out loud? And here's the forensic detail that matters most. If information was deleted from those apps, Cellebrite can often tell you not just what was deleted, but exactly when it was deleted. That timestamp becomes independent evidence all by itself, sitting right there next to the GPS data and the call logs, regardless of what the deleted content actually was. Because you can delete a photo, but you can't delete the fact that you deleted it. The deletion event itself is recorded. The timestamp is recorded. The account that made the deletion is recorded. That's how forensics works. That's how you prove what someone is hiding. And then there's the legal layer underneath all of this. The family issued preservation notices. Formal legal warnings sent directly to the families of Nolan's friends, not just his friends, their families. These notices say don't touch anything, don't delete anything, don't alter anything, don't access any data, don't make any copies, and here's why that matters legally. Courts can treat destroyed evidence as an admission of guilt, even without proving what was actually in it. Evidence destruction is consciousness of guilt. It's treated as an implied confession, so these preservation notices are a legal tripwire. Break them, and that action itself can be used against you later. But here's the bigger picture. These preservation notices sent so broadly to family members and not just direct witnesses, that's not just criminal investigation posturing, that's civil lawsuit preparation. That's a completely separate legal track that runs on completely different rules. Lower burden of proof, broader discovery, both sides compelled to provide documents and sit for depositions under oath, sometimes producing more raw detail than the criminal case ever could. Because while a criminal defendant has constitutional protections, a civil defendant doesn't have those same rights. A civil discovery process can pull information that a grand jury can't, can demand testimony that a police investigation can't compel, and that's the real reason those preservation notices went out so wide. The family isn't just waiting for prosecutors, they're building their own separate door. One they can walk through no matter what happens with the other one. Now let's talk about the audio that's been circulating. A supposedly enhanced version of the Seto distress call with background voices claiming things. But here's the problem. That audio has been doctored, heavily edited. The same audio experts examining it have confirmed it's not reliable, not authentic. It's a manipulation designed to sound damaging rather than represent what's actually on the tape. This is crucial because this is what's being shared on social media. This is what people are basing opinions on. Not the real evidence, the fake version, the doctored version, the version designed to confirm what people already believe rather than show what actually happened. So here's what we actually have versus what people think we have. The real Seto distress call is relatively clear. Someone calling for help because the bilge pump stopped working. The boat is taking on water. They need assistance. That's documented. That's real. But floating around the internet is a version that's been edited, enhanced, manipulated to make it sound like something completely different. And that edited version is what's being cited as proof. That's not evidence, that's propaganda. But here's where it actually gets interesting, because there's a completely legitimate gap in the real evidence that doesn't need any exaggeration to hold up. Dr. Judy Melinek, board-certified forensic pathologist, looked at the official autopsy findings and identified one specific detail, a roughly 12 by 8-inch patch of red discoloration found at the back of Nolan's skull. No cut in the skin above it, no fracture in the bone underneath. On the surface, that sounds suspicious, but here's what Melinek explains. That exact spot is also where a body gets physically supported on a block during a standard autopsy. Meaning this discoloration could be pressure from the first autopsy itself, nothing to do with any injury he suffered while alive. The only way to actually know is under a microscope, checking for real cellular level evidence of bleeding versus simple pooling after death or handling artifacts. That's Dr. Mitchell's next step. But that's not his only step, because there's toxicology to consider. And here's a detail almost nobody talks about. After death, bacteria in a decomposing body can actually produce alcohol on their own. No drinking required, no liquor involved, just the natural bacterial process of decomposition. In a body decomposed enough, bacteria alone can push a blood alcohol reading above the legal limit, up to 0.2% in some cases. That's above the legal driving limit without Nolan ever taking a single drink. Given how many days passed before Nolan was recovered, given how decomposed his body was by the time the first autopsy happened, any alcohol reading in his toxicology is going to need real interpretation against that decomposition. Not a headline, not a quick conclusion, not a social media post, real expert analysis by someone who understands how decomposition affects toxicology readings. Because you can't just look at a blood alcohol number and assume it means he was drunk. You have to account for bacterial alcohol production. You have to account for decomposition time. You have to account for storage conditions and the autopsy process itself. That's forensic toxicology. That's the science that actually matters. This is the critical difference between what the evidence actually says and what people online are saying it says. Dr. Melinik's real analysis is careful, methodical, full of hedges, full of "we can't know that yet," full of multiple explanations laid out honestly side by side. She says, "It's possible," not "it definitely is." She says, "This requires more examination," not "this proves murder." That carefulness isn't weakness. It's the entire point of actual expert analysis. It's what separates real forensics from speculation. It's what separates someone who understands the science from someone trying to go viral on social media. But what's floating around online is something else entirely. Content that strips out every hedge and keeps only the parts that sound certain. Phrases like, "That's precisely what's unfolding right now," that weren't actually said but sound like expert confirmation, turning an honest, unresolved gap into something that reads like a confirmed conclusion. That's not the same thing as what she actually said, even when it's quoting her, even when it seems to be using her own words. It's the difference between "the evidence gap makes strangulation possible" and "Dr. Melinik says he was strangled." One is accurate, one is propaganda dressed up as expertise. And that's the real danger with this case right now. Not the sealed documents, not the delayed investigation, but the constant stream of misinformation masquerading as analysis. The doctored audio being treated as proof, the social media theories being treated as evidence, the speculation being treated as fact. Because here's what's true, the evidence will come out. The grand jury will see the autopsy, the digital forensics will rebuild the timeline, the truth will emerge eventually, but by then, how many people will have already made up their minds based on edited audio and social media theories instead of actual evidence? So here's what's actually happening right now, while this case waits for a grand jury. The family is doing its own forensic investigation. They're not waiting for authorities to give them answers. They subpoenaed every major tech platform for Nolan's deleted data. They issued preservation notices to ensure evidence doesn't get destroyed. They're building a civil lawsuit track completely independent of whatever the DA decides to do. A team is reconstructing his last hours minute by minute. A forensic pathologist has identified one specific real, unresolved gap in the evidence: the missing neck structures that only direct access to the original autopsy file can close. And there's a real difference worth learning to spot every single time between what the evidence actually says and what people are saying it says online. 4 different friends have now given 4 different accounts of Nolan's final decision on that beach. Was he staying? Was he leaving? Was he with Katie? The story keeps changing, and the question becomes why? Why do 4 kids who were supposedly together have 4 different stories about what Nolan said? Why does the narrative shift every time new evidence emerges? Why does each friend's account seem designed to protect himself rather than remember Nolan? None of that changed this week. What changed is that the pile of real hard evidence sitting behind all of it got a little bigger, and stayed exactly as sealed as it was before. The autopsy is finished. The toxicology is finished. Both are locked away. The digital forensics are underway. The preservation notices are live. The civil suit track is being built, and a grand jury is coming. The question isn't whether the evidence will come out eventually. It will. The question is what happens between now and then. Because Nolan's friends had lawyers before the search even ended. They coordinated their story. They aligned their accounts. And they've been silent ever since. That silence while evidence gets recovered. That silence while timestamps get documented. That silence while a family fights for answers. That silence while his mother has to go to court to gain access to information about her own son's death. That tells you something all by itself. Innocent people panic. Innocent people talk. Innocent people cooperate. Innocent people help search. But these 4? Lawyers. Silence. Coordination. Protection. That's what Nolan's friends did while his body was still in the water. That's what they've done every day since. And that silence is louder than any audio recording could ever be. We'll keep following this as those subpoenaed records come back, as Dr. Mitchell's tissue exam produces something conclusive, as the digital forensics reveal what was deleted and when, as the grand jury finally sees what the DA has been protecting behind those sealed doors. We tell you what's confirmed, not what's implied, every single time. We analyze what the evidence actually means, not what social media thinks it means. We separate the real gaps in knowledge from the filled-in speculation, because Nolan Wells deserves that, his family deserves that, and everyone watching this deserves to know the difference between evidence and entertainment. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. When that grand jury reaches conclusions, we'll report them verified and accurate. When new evidence emerges, we'll break it down methodically. When answers finally come, we'll celebrate them with a family that has fought harder than any family should have to fight to get justice for their son. Thank you for watching.